Hey y'all, Andrew Waller here. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with me or my channel, my name is Andrew. I'm a PhD candidate in New Testament studies at Ridley College, Melbourne. Um, I am making this video kind of to pick up on a couple things Gavin Ortlund said recently in a video he did about William Lane Craig's recent article in First Things. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, check out Gavin's video. He does a really good job laying out some key issues there. Check out the article in First Things. I will link both of those in the description. And I just want to say at the outset, my purpose in making this video isn't really to engage in any arguments that have been presented necessarily, but mostly just to pick up on maybe some concerns about how we use genre in thinking about the historicity of Genesis, the Gospels, things like that. So I'm approaching this mostly from a point of, I guess, concern as someone who studies the Gospels primarily from the perspective of narrative and literary theory. Just some things that I noticed and some things that may be helpful. So, a couple things that Gavin pointed out in his video. Number one, that there is, quote, a difference between how the Bible narrates truth and whether it narrates truth. So, dealing with this question of, how is Genesis communicating? And how does that relate to the historicity or the truth of what it is communicating? And the place where Gavin kind of ended up in terms of like what's next, there are these discussions about what genre is Genesis. William Lane Craig suggesting the genre of mythohistory. Other folks have different ideas about how we should treat the genre of Genesis, particularly Genesis 1 through 11. Where does that leave us? And one thing that Gavin noted was biblical hermeneutics. Looking at the actual genre of the text, using that in a good faith way in our reading process, in our interpretation, and I agree with that. And so, where I want to pick up is, for all of the talk about the genre of Genesis, and this basically everything I'm about to say holds true for the Gospels as well. How does genre actually fit into how we interpret? How does it enter into our reading process? And so I'm not necessarily going to provide a solution or, I guess, any sort of way that I'm going to prescribe that we should do this, but simply to make some observations. Things do get quite tricky when we um, start thinking about genre. And one thing I've noticed is that when it comes to Genesis, again, especially Genesis 1 through 11, sometimes people assert that the genre or the generic conventions that we ascribe to a text then necessitate that we conceive of that text's relationship to reality in a specific way. Um, I came across a quote from a scholar named Thomas Bolin. As far as I know, he does a lot of work on sort of Israelite historiography. I actually came across this quote as an epigraph in a chapter of David Litwaw's How the Gospels Became History. And I thought it was kind of relevant to some parts of this discussion. Bolin says that, and he's talking about historiography of ancient Israel, so how ancient Israelites are writing down, making historical records, and how we understand that and how we interact with those texts. And he says, fundamentally, the question comes down to whether genre designation lies in the eye of the author or the reader. Much of the present confusion in both sides of the debate about Israelite historiography is due to the fact that the term historiography is understood not as a genre classification, but rather as a sort of truth claim founded upon the assumption of equivocation between historical fact and truth. And this quote comes from a chapter that Bolin contributed to a book called The Limits of Historiography. You can find this quote on page 123 in that book. And although Bolin's talking about a slightly different situation than the historicity of Genesis 1 to 11, for example. I understand him as saying here, at least in part, that there isn't always a one-to-one correlation between genre and a text's representation of real events. And I think that's correct. So when the topic of genre comes up, especially in relation to event or topics that touch on apologetics issues or polemical issues, I'm a little wary because there are some limits to what we're able to claim on the basis of genre that aren't always acknowledged. And so, to kind of illustrate this, I want to use an example. Uh, The Office, very popular television show. Um, The Office uses the form or the genre of documentary style filmmaking. Uh, if you look at the way that the show is shot, the camera is frequently handheld. Characters often speak directly to the audience through these sort of interview style segments. The stories that are portrayed are, in some ways, meant to be realistic in that they're mimicking real life scenarios, types of people that we as the audience might be familiar with. I think that's one of the reasons why so many people connect with that show. And so, based solely on the text, if you will, based solely on what is in The Office, based on the camera work, the realistic content, the acknowledgement that there is a production crew that's even sort of part of the story, um, you could make an argument that The Office belongs to the genre of documentary. And in fact, there's kind of this mockumentary almost genre of sitcoms that's been adopted by other shows. Modern Family is kind of another example of that. Um, but would I then be justified in saying that because of that genre classification, we are then obligated to treat The Office as historical fact? Well, no. We sort of understand that based on the context of what's going on, based on uh, the context of it being a television show and sort of how we as viewers understand what's going on there, we know that The Office is not communicating with us in that way. We understand that it's not a documentary, despite the sort of formal characteristics and perhaps even genre conventions of documentary. There's a similar situation with, and this is kind of an example that illustrates the fuzzy lines between genres. The Blair Witch Project, a horror film from quite some time back, kind of the progenitor of found footage horror movies as we know them. Uh, this film largely popularized that sort of subgenre, found footage. Um, the movie largely consisted of handheld camcorder footage. And because there was no formal indication in the film itself that the events portrayed were fictional, a lot of people got confused. There was some actual genuine confusion at the time about whether or not the events portrayed in the Blair Witch Project were real. Were there actually these people that had these events happen to them? Another example might be Orson Welles' famous War of the Worlds radio broadcast and the confusion resulting from that. Um, and so there's only so much we can do on the basis of genre alone. And so you might say, well, Andrew, okay, reasonable people can tell that these are fictional stories. And so maybe this analogy isn't totally relevant to something like Genesis or the Gospels. And perhaps that is true. But my point is this: the same sorts of things that could be used to identify The Office or the Blair Witch Project as documentary are the same types of formal characteristics that are often used to classify Genesis or the Gospels as belonging to this or that genre. Okay. Vern Poythress published an article on the genre of Genesis in the Westminster Theological Journal back in 2016. where he says this, quote, Genesis belongs to the same broad genre of narrative prose as does 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Since there is no literary signal to tell us that it is fiction, and since indeed it belongs to a continuous temporal development from creation to the exile, we conclude that it is non-fiction, end quote. And so um, his argument decently rests on the idea that genres are inherent, static in the text itself, and that texts use genres to make claims about how that text connects to the real world, real events. And so, similarly to how we might look at the camera work of The Office or the found footage style of The Blair Witch Project and conclude that these are documentary, the formal elements of Genesis, such as the style of the prose, the syntax of the language, um, these are also used to justify a particular genre classification. And then a claim of historicity is made on the basis of that genre classification. So Poythress says, because Genesis is of the same genre as 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we know that 1st and 2nd Samuel are referring to historical events, therefore Genesis as well should be read as referring to these historical events in the same way. Okay. Poythress even goes so far as to say that the text itself makes this claim of historicity because of or through its genre. And so I bring this up not necessarily to engage Poythress's argument itself, but to simply observe that, at least in my experience, this is a somewhat common way of advocating for the historicity of Genesis and the Gospels. The text belongs to a genre that intends to communicate historical things, and therefore the events portrayed are historical. So genre equals historical. Or on the other side of things, you could do this the other way as well. Genesis 1 might have weird syntax and it's poetic in a way, and other features that don't really align with how we understand historical prose. And therefore, on that basis, we conclude that it's merely metaphorical or figurative or non-historical in some way. Either way, building a bridge to historicity solely on the basis, or even primarily on the basis, of genre leaves out, in my view, a lot of evidence and a lot of data. For the Gospels, you can do this as well. The argument will be made that the Gospels most closely resemble ancient biographies, and so they belong to the genre of biography. Therefore, solely on the basis of this idea, they should be taken as 100% historical, in the way that we might take a biography as historical. And of course, I agree that the Gospels are biography in some way, but I don't agree that we can argue for their historicity solely or even primarily on the basis of a genre classification. In my view, this flattens out the way that narrative works. Genre isn't just something that is inherent or fixed or static within a text. It involves the reader or the audience as well. And so we have to consider how the conventions of a particular genre are received by those who engage with a text. We have to consider what the text is intending to communicate. We have to consider the matrix of reader, text, author. All of these things are important parts of what narrative is and how it communicates. And so, at least in my view, it is not simply enough to say that because a text has a particular set of conventions and characteristics, that therefore we must read it as presenting historical events. So, when we make arguments for historicity, based primarily on this or that genre classification. We are taking just one part of how narrative communicates and totalizing it or absolutizing it. We're taking one aspect of Scripture's communication to us and making that one aspect disproportionately large in our thinking. And so there's a lot more to this question of, is Genesis historical? Are the Gospels historical? There's a lot more to answering that question than perhaps a simple genre classification. Um, so there's a lot to think about when it comes to what these texts are and how they communicate. And so my concern is that, unfortunately, sometimes arguments based on genre can be used as an apologetic or polemical shortcut, uh, such that, well, if we can prove that Genesis has some sort of inherent, uh, fixed historical genre, that means we might be able to bypass a lot of other arguments or other evidence that might be more difficult to think through or explain. Same thing with the Gospels. If we can somehow prove that the Gospels are 100% historical because they have this specific genre that's irrefutable in some way, that means I can kind of do a polemical slam dunk, and I can ignore some of the complexities that go along with engaging that text and engaging with the fullness of how it communicates. So I'm saying that narrative texts are complex. We need to deal with that complexity in the way that we read them. Okay. But you might be thinking, are there people actually out there claiming that genre alone is an appropriate basis for historicity? And I'd like to think that even though some people primarily try to answer the question of historicity based on genre, they might agree with me that there's more going on. That's my hope. But, if you look around the internet, oftentimes articles dealing with the historicity of Genesis will make much of genre, and that's fine. Um, but I in my experience, at least, so much of the discourse surrounding the historicity of Genesis, and perhaps I should caveat this by saying discourse that is probably primarily evangelical and Protestant, so your mileage may vary in other traditions, but a lot of that discourse tends to boil down to discussions of genre, for better or for worse. And so many of these discussions end up, in my view, doing what I have described above and flattening out genre and how it works. And so, as someone who is personally very convinced of the idea that the Bible features complex narratives and we need to be using the right tools and thinking in the right way about how narratives work in order to read the Bible in the fullest way possible, from my perspective, uh, in discussions about Genesis or the Gospels and their historicity, genre is sometimes given uh, an inappropriately dominant seat at the table when it comes to those discussions, even though it's only one part of how narratives communicate and how narratives should be interpreted. So, lots of Christians who may not be familiar with some of these ideas about genre and narrative and how these things work, they hear somebody say, well, Genesis belongs to the genre of historical narrative or historical prose. And therefore, because it belongs to that genre, all the events it describes happened exactly the way they described them in this historical way. And folks remember that. And so I've definitely been in situations where I might be talking about one of the Gospels and how the author has, shaped the narrative in this or that way. And someone will say, wait, hold on, Andrew. I thought the Gospels were historical narratives. I thought they were biographies. How can you say that the author is changing this or that aspect of the story? How does that make sense? Uh, some people have latched on to this idea that because a text belongs to a particular genre, we can therefore make absolute claims about the historicity of a text. And so it's like, all right, let's talk about it. Let's figure this out. And so I'm not saying that everyone needs to be an expert in narratology or literary theory in order to read the Bible. Definitely not saying that. But I am saying that reading scripture and reading scripture well are important. And it's important enough that we should be committed to doing the hard work of dealing with the fullness of how God communicates to us through narrative. And part of that involves having an appropriate understanding of genre, making sure we're using these concepts appropriately and not sort of flattening out the way that genre works in order to sort of score apologetic points or to inappropriately uh, bolster our confidence in the text. Um, so, in my view, we create many more problems than we solve when we flatten out and inappropriately prioritize the role of genre in narrative communication. And when we present a particular notion of historical or historiographical genre as an apologetic and polemical panacea. So those are really my concerns. I am not here to tell anyone how they should read Genesis or the Gospels, at least not in this video. But I did just want to kind of outline some of those concerns about ways in which I see genre being perhaps inappropriately deployed in some of these discussions. To connect this back to the First Things article, I have no issue with the category of mythohistory. The idea that Genesis presents a theologically shaped history or some combination of myth and history, I'm okay with that. And so, again, my point is not to criticize or engage with William Lane Craig's notion of the genre of Genesis, but simply to say there is more to consider when it comes to how we think about genre and how it impacts our reading of Scripture. A lot more that could be said, but I will leave it at that. So check out Gavin's video, check out the First Things article. Again, those will be linked down in the description. But yeah, thanks for listening. See you in the next one.